Anne Boleyn's name is synonymous with intrigue, passion, and tragedy, forever etched in the annals of history. A woman who rose from relative obscurity to sit at the throne of England, only to fall from grace in the most spectacular and dramatic fashion, Anne's story is one of ambition, defiance, and transformation. As the catalyst for the English Reformation, the mother of Elizabeth I, and a queen whose fate was sealed by the very court she had once dazzled, Anne Boleyn's life and death continue to captivate us. Her legacy has been shaped by the intricacies of power, gender, and politics in a world where a single misstep could mean the difference between a crown and a scaffold. But what is it about and that keeps us fascinated, even centuries after her execution? It is the complexity of her character, her unwavering determination to shape her own destiny, and the lasting imprint she left on history that makes her one of the most unforgettable figures in royal lore. Before Anne Boleyn ever walked the corridors of power or captured the eye of a king, England was a nation steeped in Catholic orthodoxy, tethered to the papal authority in Rome, and ruled by the divine legitimacy of a monarch whose decisions were seldom questioned. The early 16th century in England was a time of immense tension beneath the surface. Religious dissatisfaction was growing, power dynamics at court were shifting, and the Tudor dynasty, though recently established, was under pressure to secure a lasting legacy. King Henry VIII, the second Tudor monarch, had been married for nearly 2 decades to Catherine of Aragon without producing a male heir. This failure to continue the royal line was seen not only as a personal and political crisis for Henry, but as a national concern. Into this world of uncertainty and patriarchal expectation entered Anne Boleyn, a woman whose intelligence, charm, and ambition would upend centuries of religious tradition, alter the course of monarchy, and etch her name into history. Not merely as a queen, but as a queen who defied everything that was expected of her. Anne Boleyn remains one of the most captivating figures in English history, not simply because of her tragic end, a queen executed by the very man who once adored her, but because of the astonishing impact she had in such a short span of time. In an age where women were largely confined to the domestic and the decorative, Anne rose to become one of the most influential political and religious figures of her generation. She was not content to play the role of a passive royal mistress or a submissive wife. She negotiated with kings, engaged with theologians, and championed a religious vision that would eventually split England from Rome. Her defiance, of the Pope of tradition of her gender's assigned role, makes her a compelling subject even centuries after her death. And yet, Anne remains elusive. She is at once remembered as a scheming temptress and a proto-feminist martyr, a religious reformer and a political manipulator, a victim and a victor. The tension between the myth of Anne Boleyn and the reality of her life forms the foundation of her ongoing legacy. Anne's historical significance cannot be overstated. Without Anne Boleyn, the English Reformation might never have unfolded in the way it did. Though many religious thinkers were already advocating for reform, such as Martin Luther in Germany and William Tyndale in England, it was Anne's relationship with Henry VIII that catalyzed the break from Rome. Henry's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine and Mary and created what became known as the King's Great Matter. When the Pope refused the annulment, Henry rejected the Pope's authority entirely. This wasn't a mere romantic entanglement, it was a seismic shift in the religious landscape of Europe. And encouraged Henry to read reformist literature, introduced him to influential thinkers like Thomas Cranmer, and supported the publication of the English Bible. Whether or not Anne saw herself as a reformer, her influence accelerated a religious revolution that reshaped England forever. Moreover, her role in the royal court represented a broader upheaval. Unlike many noble women of her time, Anne did not come from a royal house, nor did she wield military power or foreign alliances. Her influence stemmed from her mind, her presence, and her ability to navigate court politics. She refused Henry's advances for years, holding out not for gifts or power, but for marriage, an astonishing act of ambition for a woman of her station. In doing so, she changed the nature of queenship in England, and did not quietly bear children or play a symbolic role. She engaged in statecraft, aligned herself with political factions, and even had enemies eliminated, including, ultimately, herself. But for a time, she held the king's favor and used it to reshape the very foundations of the monarchy. The intrigue surrounding Anne Boleyn's story also stems from the mystery and contradictions that continue to surround her. Historians have long debated whether Anne was a Protestant martyr or a courtly opportunist, whether she loved Henry or merely tolerated him. whether she was guilty of the charges of adultery and incest for which she was executed, or whether these were trumped-up accusations designed to remove her from power. The sources we have, letters, court records, ambassadorial reports, are often colored by bias, either damning her as a seductress or sanctifying her as a victim of political machinations. Over the centuries, Anne has been alternately vilified and sanctified, romanticized and demonized. In popular culture, she appears as both the doomed queen in tragic love stories and the cunning manipulator in dramas of ambition and betrayal. But neither extreme fully captures the complex reality of who she was. This complexity is what continues to draw us to Anne Boleyn. She defied the expectations of her gender, challenged religious orthodoxy, and manipulated a system that was designed to marginalize her. She was bold, articulate, politically aware, and unwavering in her refusal to be anything less than a queen. And she paid the ultimate price for that refusal. But even in death, she changed England. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, would become one of the most powerful and celebrated monarchs in British history. Elizabeth rarely spoke of her mother, but the strength, intellect, and independence she embodied seem unmistakably inherited. The story of Anne Boleyn begins not in royal palaces or great cathedrals, but in the rising world of English gentry and ambition, where families climbed through ranks of power by virtue of commerce, marriage, and courtly service. The Boleyn family was not originally aristocratic in the grandest sense, but represented a new kind of English success story. Wealthy, well-connected, and increasingly influential. Their roots lay in the fertile lands of Norfolk, where their fortune began with shrewd dealings in trade and landholding. From these modest but respectable beginnings, the Boleyns rose steadily, becoming fixtures at the English court and aligning themselves with the powerful and noble families of Tudor England. Anne's grandfather, Geoffrey Boleyn, was a key figure in this transformation. He made his fortune as a successful London mercer, a member of the merchant class that was beginning to rival the old nobility in wealth and influence. He was shrewd, educated, and ambitious. Eventually, his accomplishments earned him the title of Lord Mayor of London in 1457, a position that not only confirmed his social ascent, but also opened doors into circles of nobility. He purchased Hever Castle in Kent and Blickling Hall in Norfolk, establishing the family's physical presence among England's landed elite. Through land, money, and smart marriages, the Boleyns elevated their name within just 2 generations. Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, was the embodiment of this new ambition. Educated at Oxford and fluent in several languages, he was a man of wit, intelligence, and remarkable diplomatic skill. His rise through the Tudor court was rapid and carefully calculated. He served under Henry VII and became even more prominent during the reign of Henry VIII, holding various key positions including ambassador to the Netherlands and France, and eventually rising to become Earl of Wiltshire and Earl of Ormond. These titles were more than ceremonial. They symbolized his growing power and recognition. Thomas was not a warrior or a knight who earned glory on the battlefield. Rather, his weapon was diplomacy, and his battleground was the royal court. Thomas Boleyn's ambition was deeply tied to his children. He was determined to secure their positions within the elite circles of power and influence. In this, he was not merely a social climber but a strategic thinker. He ensured that his children were educated and polished, capable of thriving in international courts. He recognized the value of courtly training, linguistic fluency, and cultural sophistication. Anne and her siblings would be groomed not simply as noble offspring, but as tools for advancement. Their personal accomplishments would reflect back upon the family, helping to solidify the Boleyns' newfound aristocratic identity. Anne's mother, Elizabeth Howard, added even more luster to the Boleyn name. She was the daughter of Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful and storied noblemen in England. The Howard family was among the oldest and most prestigious aristocratic houses, deeply entrenched in the military and political fabric of the country. Elizabeth's marriage to Thomas Boleyn was a significant alliance, one that conferred nobility upon the Boleyns through blood and association. Though it is unclear how affectionate their marriage was, it was undoubtedly a strategic match. Elizabeth brought with her not just connections, but a lineage that could be proudly presented at court and referenced in royal negotiations. It was through her mother's side that Anne could claim kinship to dukes, earls, and even royal blood. This connection was vital to Anne's later claims and her sense of identity. It bolstered the Boleyn family's image and helped position Anne not just as a court lady or consort, but as a legitimate contender for queenship, an idea that would have seemed unthinkable for a merchant's granddaughter just decades earlier. And had two siblings who also played significant roles at court and in the family's ambitions. Her brother George Boleyn, later Viscount Rochford, was an intelligent and charismatic young man, educated like and in the humanist tradition. He served in diplomatic roles and was deeply involved in the intellectual and religious currents of the time, particularly those tied to reform and Protestantism. George and Anne were close, both mentally sharp, socially confident, and politically savvy. George's tragic downfall would later be inseparable from Anne's own fall from grace, as he was accused alongside her of incest and treason. Mary Boleyn, Anne's elder sister, had a very different trajectory. Sent to the French court early in life like Anne, Mary gained a reputation for beauty and charm, but not the intellectual brilliance that her younger sister would become known for. She became a mistress to King Henry VIII before Anne ever caught his eye, although their relationship was relatively brief and politically inconsequential. Mary was eventually married off, but her ties to the king and her early presence at court laid the groundwork for Anne's eventual arrival in the king's inner circle. The sisters' contrasting paths, one demure and scandal-shrouded, the other ambitious and ultimately tragic, highlight the complex web of expectations and limitations placed on women at court. Both Anne and Mary were raised with the expectation of court life. Their education was typical of noble girls, but emphasized refinement and readiness for high society. They were taught languages, music, dance, etiquette, and needlework. But Anne's education went far beyond the domestic. She was sent abroad, first to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, and later to the French court, where she absorbed Renaissance culture, learned to navigate elite society, and developed a taste for theological and literary debate. Her time in Europe left a lasting mark on her. She learned not only French and Latin, but also diplomacy, fashion, and the art of courtly behavior. These skills would later serve her well when she returned to England and began her ascent. Anne's grooming for court was not an accident or indulgence. It was part of a larger plan. The Boleyns understood that the Tudor court was a theater of power where alliances were made and broken through conversation, appearance, and charm. A woman's ability to shine in this arena could change the fate of her entire family. Anne's father in particular saw his daughters as vital extensions of his political ambitions. By placing them in powerful foreign courts and eventually at the heart of English politics, he advanced not only their individual fortunes, but the Boleyn legacy as a whole. The Boleyns were not unique in using their daughters as part of their strategy for advancement, but they were exceptionally successful. What set Anne apart was her sharp mind, her refusal to be used in the traditional manner, and her uncanny ability to command attention. From an early age, she was aware of the expectations placed upon her, but she also understood the levers of power. She watched how men wielded influence and how women could manipulate favor. Unlike her sister Mary, who submitted to the roles expected of a court lady and royal mistress, and shaped her own narrative. In retrospect, the rise of the Boleyn family seems both inevitable and precarious. They were never quite accepted by the old nobility as true equals, despite their wealth and marriages. Their meteoric climb was admired and resented in equal measure. This tension would become more pronounced as Anne's fortunes soared and then collapsed. Yet their origins offer vital context for understanding Anne's personality and ambition. She came from a family that taught her to strive, to perform, to charm, and to endure. They gave her tools, opportunities, and expectations, but not the script. That she would write herself. In the decades before Anne became queen, the Boleyn family demonstrated what was possible in Tudor England for those with cunning, charm, and ambition. They rose not by force but by finesse, not by armies but by alliances. They believed in the court as the center of power and trained their children accordingly. And was the most brilliant product of this vision, polished, perceptive, determined. The court did not just shape Anne Boleyn, it was shaped by her. The legacy of the Boleyn family, though eventually darkened by scandal and tragedy, began with the quiet and determined efforts of a family intent on transformation. In Anne, that transformation reached its most extraordinary and dangerous form. Anne Boleyn's journey from a promising English girl of noble birth to one of the most enigmatic figures in Tudor history truly began when she was sent abroad as a young teenager. Her formative years on the European continent gave her a depth of experience, intellect, and sophistication unmatched by most women of the English court. These years did more than simply educate her. They shaped her worldview, her manner, and her ambitions in ways that would ultimately distinguish her from her peers and make her an irresistible figure to a king. Anne's first destination was the court of Margaret of Austria, regent of the Habsburg Netherlands, one of the most refined and intellectually vibrant courts in Europe. This was no ordinary placement for a young English girl. Margaret's court in Mechelen, in present-day Belgium, was a haven for education, diplomacy, and culture. It was rare for a young woman from England to be sent there, and her selection reflects the Boleyn family's rising status and strong diplomatic connections, likely secured through her father Thomas Boleyn's own service as a diplomat in the region. At Margaret's court, and was surrounded by powerful noble families, learned clerics, artists, and humanists. She lived among young aristocratic children destined for great things, and was immersed in a highly cultured and politically astute environment. Margaret of Austria herself was an exceptional role model. A widow by the age of 24, she chose never to remarry and ruled the Netherlands with grace, intelligence, and political skill. She was fluent in several languages, well-versed in classical texts, and patronized some of the leading humanist scholars of her time. Living under her influence, and witnessed a model of female authority that would stay with her throughout her life. She learned the values of self-control, eloquence, and court diplomacy, all essential for survival and success in any European court, but especially in the politically turbulent world of Tudor England. Anne's time in the Netherlands was brief, less than a year, but it was foundational. It prepared her for the next and even more formative phase of her education, the French court. She joined the household of Mary Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII, who had recently married King Louis XII of France. Though that marriage was short-lived, and remained in France even after Mary returned to England, becoming part of the household of Queen Claude, the devout and intellectual wife of Francis I. For nearly 7 years and served in Queen Claude's court and at times, likely in the household of Queen Margaret of Navarre, Francis's sister and a well-known supporter of reformist religious thinkers. In the French court and flourished. The French court was a dynamic center of Renaissance culture, buzzing with ideas from Italy and the Low Countries. It was at once decadent and cerebral, where fashion was intertwined with art, and where conversations ranged from politics to poetry to theology. Anne observed and absorbed all of it. She became fluent in French, a rarity among English ladies of the time. Her accent and style were said to be polished, her manner elegant, and her tastes sophisticated, qualities that would later set her apart at the English court. She studied music, dance, embroidery, and literature. She watched carefully how noble women carried themselves, how they spoke, how they dressed, how they navigated the court. It was here that Anne's interest in the Renaissance ideals of humanism likely deepened. Humanism emphasized individual intellect, classical education, and moral virtue, values that Anne would later echo in her own actions and speech. She read French poetry and likely studied the writings of Erasmus, Petrarch, and Christine de Pizan. The court of Queen Claude was known not for frivolity but for refinement, piety, and education. Claude herself was known for her religious devotion and her promotion of moral instruction for women. Under her patronage, Anne would have been expected to exemplify decorum, modesty, and intelligence. The influence of Margaret of Navarre was even more significant. A protector of reformist writers like Lefebvre d'Etaples and an early supporter of what would become Protestant thought, Margaret's circle included many who were questioning the authority of the Catholic Church and emphasizing a more personal, scripture-based faith. Though Anne remained a Catholic during her years in France, her exposure to these ideas planted seeds that would later blossom when she returned to England and became a key figure in the religious transformation that led to the English Reformation. Apart from the intellectual and spiritual influences, Anne's French experience shaped her aesthetically and socially. French fashion at the time was elegant and daring, and Anne adopted its sense of sophistication. Her clothes, mannerisms, and confidence made her seem almost foreign when she returned to England. She wore her hair differently, favored French styles of dress, and moved with a grace that marked her as distinct. English courtiers noticed her immediately, not because of classic beauty, but because of her striking self-possession, her expressive dark eyes, her wit, and the aura of cosmopolitan flair she exuded. And also learned the subtleties of courtly love, an important cultural concept in France. Courtly love emphasized refined romance, often idealized and conducted through music, poetry, and flirtation. It was a highly ritualized form of interaction that allowed women a space, however narrow, to exercise influence. And mastered this form. She understood how to be intriguing without being promiscuous, how to flirt without yielding, and how to make herself indispensable without being overreaching. These skills would later become central to her relationship with Henry VIII. When, and eventually returned to England, likely around 1522, she was no longer a provincial noblewoman. She was a polished, self-aware, and highly educated lady, fluent in the cultural codes of Europe's most sophisticated courts. Her years abroad had fundamentally changed her, giving her not only knowledge, but also a vision of what a woman could be beyond the limits imposed by English society. In contrast to many English ladies of the court who had been raised with limited educational opportunities and strong social constraints, and had seen powerful women in action, she had learned how influence could be wielded through conversation, intelligence, and charm, not just through marriage and obedience. This upbringing made and both admired and resented when she re-entered English court life. She was intriguing and magnetic, but also seen as too sharp, too assertive, and too clever. Her French education had given her a broader worldview, one that allowed her to challenge assumptions and assert herself in subtle but powerful ways. Where other women might defer and would negotiate, where others might conform and would question. She was not reckless, she was strategic, bold, and highly aware of the roles she was expected to play, yet she often subverted them to her advantage. The religious ideas she encountered in France also began to influence her thinking more directly. While Anne never openly declared herself a Protestant, and in fact died a practicing Catholic, there is little doubt that her sympathies leaned toward reform. She favored the idea of reading the Bible in one's own language, supported religious reformers like William Tyndale and Thomas Cranmer, and encouraged Henry VIII to break with Rome. These tendencies can be traced back to her years under Margaret of Navarre and the reformist atmosphere of the French court. Her exposure to continental reform movements gave her the ideological foundation for the role she would later play in England's religious revolution. Anne Boleyn's time in Europe was more than just a youthful sojourn. It was a crucible in which her intellect, identity, and ambition were forged. She saw what the world could offer beyond the limitations of English tradition. She learned to navigate complex court politics, to manipulate language and appearance, and to use knowledge as a form of power. The education she received was not confined to books and etiquette. It included exposure to the currents of thought, art, and belief that were reshaping Europe. This experience explains much of what made Anne so compelling to Henry VIII and so threatening to others. She was not content to play a passive role. She was capable of conversation, argument, and persuasion. She had seen powerful women like Margaret of Austria and Margaret of Navarre lead with dignity and intelligence. She had internalized Renaissance ideals of virtue, eloquence, and personal agency. She had been shaped by courts where women, though constrained, could exercise meaningful influence. And she brought all of this back with her to England, quietly, yet indelibly transformed. Her years abroad were essential in setting her apart. They made her the woman who could capture a king's heart not through submission, but through intrigue and challenge. They equipped her to survive in the lion's den of Tudor politics for as long as she did. And they laid the groundwork for her legacy, not just as a tragic queen, but as a woman educated by Europe, formed by the Renaissance, and capable of changing the very course of English history. When Anne Boleyn returned to England around 1522, after spending several years in the cultured courts of Europe, she did so not as an ordinary young noblewoman, but as a striking and unusually sophisticated figure. Fluent in French, familiar with continental fashion, and molded by the intellectual vibrancy of Margaret of Austria's and Queen Claude's courts, Anne immediately stood out from her peers. She was not merely a lady of the English court. She was a woman of Europe, shaped by Renaissance humanism and the elegance of foreign courts. It was this unique upbringing that would help Anne gain entry into the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish-born wife of King Henry VIII and the reigning Queen of England, and was appointed as one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, a position that placed her in daily proximity to the Queen and, importantly, within the inner workings of the Tudor court. This role was a strategic one for ambitious noble families. Ladies-in-waiting attended the Queen, assisted in her daily routines, entertained at court functions, and were expected to embody grace, charm, and discretion. It was a courtly position, but it also offered visibility, influence, and a chance to attract the attention of powerful men. In Anne's case, this court placement would eventually prove fateful. The English court at the time was a lively and often treacherous place, brimming with ambition, flirtation, and political maneuvering. Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, was already a known figure at court and had been the mistress of King Henry VIII, a fact that would later lead to much gossip and speculation. The sisters, though close in youth, were vastly different in temperament and ambition. Mary was reputed to be more passive and compliant, while Anne was intellectual, quick-witted, and sharper in both mind and tongue. Though often lumped together in popular imagination, they led very different lives at court. Mary's affair with Henry VIII had been short-lived, and is thought to have brought her little more than momentary attention and scandal. In contrast, Anne would come to challenge the very structure of the monarchy itself. Court gossip, as always, was rampant. Anne, with her dark eyes, olive skin, and French-accented speech, was an object of fascination. She did not possess the fair-haired, pale-skinned beauty ideal of Tudor England, but her charisma was undeniable. Men were drawn to her, not merely for her looks, but for her intellect, her musical talents, and her enigmatic presence. She played instruments with grace, sang with skill, and could discuss literature and theology in ways few women of her time could manage. All of these qualities made her a captivating figure, though also one that drew jealousy and criticism. It was during this period that Anne's name became linked with that of Henry Percy, the heir to the earldom of Northumberland. Percy was young, noble, and idealistic, and the pair formed a close bond. It is widely believed that they fell deeply in love and even became secretly betrothed. In a court where marriages were often arranged for political reasons, this was a risky move. Anne and Percy's relationship violated the expectations of their class and their roles within the tightly controlled environment of courtly life. Their romance had a genuine emotional core, but it was politically untenable. The match was discovered before it could proceed. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the powerful Lord Chancellor and advisor to King Henry VIII, stepped in to block the engagement. His intervention was swift and unyielding. Whether he acted on orders from the king, who may have already begun to take notice of Anne, or out of concern for court politics, Wolsey made it clear that the match could not stand. Percy was forced to abandon the engagement, and Anne was left humiliated and furious. The incident left a deep mark on her psyche and would color her relationship with Wolsey for the rest of her life. Anne's resentment toward the cardinal took root here. She saw in Wolsey not merely the agent of her heartbreak, but the personification of the old order, a powerful man who stood between her and her desires. Wolsey represented the church's grip on politics, the tradition-bound structure that constrained women like Anne, and the forces that could crush private love under the heel of state power. It was a personal betrayal that would later turn into a political vendetta. Anne never forgave him. After her thwarted engagement to Percy, Anne withdrew from court life for a time. Some historians believe she was sent back to Hever Castle, her family's estate in Kent, where she remained in relative seclusion. This was not uncommon in cases of scandal or political missteps. However, during this period, Anne likely began to consider how best to navigate the dangerous waters of court politics. She returned to court eventually older, wiser, and more cautious. Her experiences had taught her the costs of unguarded emotion and the power dynamics at play in Tudor England. Meanwhile, her presence in court continued to intrigue many, including King Henry VIII. Though it is not entirely clear when he first became seriously interested in, and it is certain that by the mid-1520s, his attentions had shifted firmly toward her. Unlike with her sister Mary, Anne did not yield to the king's advances. She resisted, deflected, and delayed, employing the art of courtly love to maintain his interest without surrendering. This strategy only deepened Henry's fascination. He was used to being obeyed and indulged, and by contrast was elusive and intelligent. She did not want to be another mistress. She aimed for something higher. Anne's education abroad had taught her the rules of courtly flirtation, the game of love and power played through poetry, gifts, and veiled words. She knew how to maintain a man's attention without giving herself fully. To Henry, this made her irresistible. To others at court, it made her dangerous. As rumors of the king's growing obsession with and began to circulate, so too did criticism and whisperings about her ambitions. She was seen by some as a seductress, by others as a witch-like figure who had bewitched the king. But those who understood Anne's intellect knew she was playing a long, calculated game. Her relationship with Henry Percy had shown her what happened when love clashed with political interests. In her dealings with the king, she ensured that the terms of engagement would be on her own terms. She demanded respect, offered clever conversation, and created a persona that was both virtuous and captivating. This was a woman who knew how to maneuver in a man's world without appearing to challenge it directly, until the moment came when she would do just that. By the late 1520s, Anne was firmly established in Henry's affections, but their relationship remained physically unconsummated. She held her ground, refusing to become his mistress, even as he showered her with letters, jewels, and promises. This only increased his determination. And as Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon grew increasingly strained, due to Catherine's failure to produce a male heir and her declining health, Anne's influence grew stronger. But before she could rise any further, the memory of Cardinal Wolsey continued to haunt her. He had been her obstacle once, and she saw him as the main barrier to her future marriage to Henry. Wolsey's failure to secure the Pope's approval for an annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine sealed his fate. Anne's hostility toward Wolsey became public, and she likely played a key role in his eventual fall from grace. When he was stripped of power in 1529, Anne saw it as both personal vindication and political triumph. Anne Boleyn's years as a lady-in-waiting were a crucible in which her strength, strategy, and character were forged. It was during this time that she learned to navigate the intricate codes of the Tudor court, tested the boundaries of her ambition, and began to reshape the role of women in royal politics. From the heartbreak of a forbidden love to the slow-burning passion of a king, from court gossip to the downfall of a cardinal, Anne's early years at court laid the foundation for her rise to power, and for the revolutionary consequences that would follow. By the late 1520s, King Henry VIII found himself at a painful crossroads. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, once built on political alliance and early affection, had become a source of frustration and anxiety. Catherine had failed to provide a male heir, something Henry saw as essential for the continuation and stability of the Tudor dynasty. Their only surviving child was a daughter, Princess Mary, and despite multiple pregnancies, Catherine had suffered repeated miscarriages and stillbirths. As Henry moved deeper into middle age, his desperation for a male successor became more acute. This dynastic pressure, coupled with his religious inclinations and a restless temperament, set the stage for one of the most dramatic episodes in English royal history. Into this tumultuous environment stepped Anne Boleyn, a woman unlike any Henry had previously known. While she had already served as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine and had been part of the courtly backdrop for years, it was only after her return from time abroad and the dissolution of her early romance with Henry Percy that she began to command the king's full attention. By all accounts, Anne was a magnetic presence. She was not the conventional beauty of the Tudor court, but her dark eyes, expressive manner, and cultivated demeanor made her stand apart. She was witty, intelligent, educated, and elegant, a product of continental refinement and a woman who seemed more partner than plaything. When Henry first turned his attentions toward Anne, he likely intended to treat her as he had others before her, as a royal mistress, a favored lover whose presence would amuse and distract him. His past entanglement with Anne's sister Mary Boleyn may have made his advances seem even more casual, at least at the outset. But Anne had already learned hard lessons at court, including the power imbalance between men and women and the fleeting nature of favor. She was not interested in becoming another discarded mistress. She understood that the only position worth holding was that of queen. Henry was not used to resistance. As king, he had long been indulged, obeyed, and surrounded by flatterers. Anne's refusal to yield, her deflection of his advances, and her intellectual engagement rather than physical compliance deeply intrigued him. Instead of submitting to his desires, Anne made herself a prize to be won. She flirted skillfully, kept him at a distance, and employed the very tools of courtly love that she had mastered in France. This strategy had a profound effect on the king. The pursuit became more than a game. As Anne continued to hold him at arm's length, Henry's feelings deepened into infatuation and eventually transformed into a conviction that he must marry her. The problem, of course, was that he was already married, and to a woman who, as the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain and aunt to the powerful Emperor Charles V, was no minor figure. The Roman Catholic Church had sanctioned his marriage to Catherine despite her prior union with his late brother Arthur, and undoing such a union would require papal approval. Henry's request for annulment was not just a private affair. It quickly spiraled into a complex religious and political crisis, and meanwhile proved far more than a passive object of desire. She recognized the significance of Henry's interest and began to maneuver herself accordingly. She surrounded herself with reform-minded courtiers, theologians, and thinkers. She read deeply, encouraged discussions of religious reform, and began to frame her own ambitions in terms not only of personal advancement, but also national transformation. She supported the distribution of English translations of the Bible and was particularly drawn to the works of reformers such as William Tyndale, whose ideas on royal supremacy would later echo in Henry's own arguments against papal authority. While and outwardly remained respectful of Catherine, she became increasingly central to the faction at court that sought religious and political change. Her private chambers became a hub of intellectual activity. She encouraged theological debate, supported clergy who favored reform, and began to envision a new kind of queenship, one that would redefine the role of women in power and challenge centuries-old traditions. Her influence over Henry began to shape his views on governance and the Church, pushing him toward a path that would ultimately sever England from Rome. During this period, Henry began writing a series of passionate love letters. These letters, some of which survive, reveal a side of the king not often seen in official records. He wrote of longing and devotion, of the pain of separation and the ecstasy of imagined union. In them, he addressed her as mine own sweetheart and begged for signs of affection. The letters also document the shifting nature of their relationship, from flirtation to frustration to an intense desire for spiritual and legal union. Anne's responses have not survived, but Henry's persistence speaks volumes about the power she held over him. These love letters were more than romantic overtures. They were political instruments. Henry increasingly began to argue that his marriage to Catherine had been unlawful from the start. Citing passages from Leviticus, he claimed that marrying his brother's widow had been an affront to divine law, and that their childless union was God's punishment. The Pope's previous dispensation, he argued, had been invalid. He now sought not just a release from Catherine, but papal recognition that the marriage had never been legitimate. Only then could he marry Anne. Anne's political astuteness emerged most clearly during this period. She understood the stakes of her elevation. If she became Henry's wife without a legitimate annulment, she risked alienating the entire Catholic world and undermining her future children's claim to the throne. She also knew that any misstep could cost her everything. For Anne, the goal was not simply to win the king's affection, but to become his lawful wife and the mother of England's heir. She was walking a tightrope, with the Queen on one side and the ambitions of courtiers and clergy on the other. As months turned into years, Henry's frustration with the papal court grew. Pope Clement VII, caught between the influence of Emperor Charles V and the theological implications of granting an annulment, stalled the process. Wolsey, once Henry's most trusted advisor, failed to deliver the desired result and was eventually dismissed, a downfall in which Anne's influence played a decisive role. With Wolsey gone, Henry's court turned increasingly toward those who favored royal supremacy over the Church, and Anne's voice grew stronger in those circles. Anne's insistence on marriage, not just intimacy, forced Henry to think beyond passion and toward revolution. If the Pope would not grant an annulment, Henry would find a way to render the Pope's authority irrelevant. It was during this stage that the seeds of the English Reformation were sown. Henry began to assert that the King of England should be the supreme head of the Church in his realm. This radical idea, which would culminate in the break with Rome, began as an act of personal will, but it was inspired and fueled by Anne. In this sense, Anne Boleyn's role in the king's religious transformation cannot be overstated. She was not merely the cause of the king's desire to annul his marriage. She was also a catalyst for the ideological and institutional changes that followed. Her own interest in Protestant ideas, her patronage of reformers, and her refusal to settle for less than queenship helped Henry rationalize and pursue a drastic shift in England's spiritual alignment. What began as a love affair was evolving into a redefinition of monarchy and church authority. By the early 1530s, Henry and Anne had secretly wed in a private ceremony, and she soon became pregnant. The legitimacy of their union was still unresolved in the eyes of the Catholic Church, but Henry had taken the matter into his own hands. In 1533, with the new Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer presiding, the marriage to Catherine was declared null and void, and Anne was crowned queen. Her ascent was now complete, though the consequences of this shift, both for her and for England, were only beginning to unfold. The rise of Anne Boleyn from lady-in-waiting to Queen of England was unprecedented. She defied tradition at every step, rejecting the passive role expected of women in her position. She demanded marriage, not seduction. She sought influence, not indulgence. And in doing so, she helped ignite a transformation that would change the religious and political landscape of England forever. The king's obsession had become a national revolution, and at the center of it stood a woman who, through intelligence, conviction, and bold ambition, reshaped the destiny of a kingdom. In the early 16th century, King Henry VIII's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon catalyzed a series of events that reshaped England's religious and political landscape. Catherine's failure to produce a male heir and Henry's growing affection for Anne Boleyn led him to seek an annulment from Pope Clement VII. However, the Pope's refusal, influenced by political pressures from Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, left Henry frustrated. This impasse prompted Henry to challenge papal authority, setting the stage for the English Reformation. Anne Boleyn played a pivotal role in this transformation. Educated in the courts of Europe, she was exposed to Renaissance humanism and reformist ideas. Anne's support for figures like William Tyndale, who advocated for the translation of the Bible into English, and her influence on appointing reform-minded clerics like Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury, underscored her commitment to religious reform. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, was instrumental in orchestrating the break from Rome. He facilitated the passage of legislation that curtailed papal authority and established the monarch as the supreme head of the Church of England. Cromwell's administrative acumen ensured the smooth implementation of these reforms, including the controversial dissolution of the monasteries. Anne's influence extended beyond her role as queen consort. She actively promoted reformist ideas, supported the distribution of English translations of the Bible, and patronized scholars and theologians aligned with Protestant principles. Her commitment to religious reform and her role in England's break from Rome highlight her significance as a reformer queen. The culmination of these efforts was the establishment of the Church of England, with the monarch at its head, marking a definitive break from papal authority. This seismic shift not only altered the religious fabric of the nation, but also redefined the relationship between the Church and the state, laying the groundwork for future religious and political developments in England. In early 1533, Anne Boleyn stood on the threshold of destiny. The long and stormy pursuit that had consumed Henry VIII for nearly 7 years culminated in a secret marriage, likely performed on January 25, even before the formal annulment of Henry's union with Catherine of Aragon. This clandestine ceremony signaled Anne's official rise, but also foreshadowed the turmoil to come. Anne was already pregnant at the time, and the urgency of legitimizing her future child, whom both she and Henry fervently hoped would be a male heir, was paramount. The king's desperate yearning for a son to secure the Tudor dynasty had driven him to cast aside papal authority, sever centuries-old ties with Rome, and install himself as supreme head of the Church of England. Anne's body was now central to this revolutionary gamble. Her pregnancy became a symbol of promise and upheaval. It marked the promise of continuity for the Tudor line, but also underscored the price paid in social and political costs. Public sentiment, initially fascinated by Anne's glamour and intelligence, began to fracture. Catherine of Aragon had long enjoyed the loyalty of the English people, particularly among more conservative Catholics who saw Anne as the brazen usurper of a rightful queen. The circumstances of the marriage, shrouded in secrecy and executed with unorthodox speed, only fueled suspicion and gossip. For many, Anne's pregnancy confirmed her ambition, that she had wielded sexuality as a weapon to ascend the throne. While some admired her wit and elegance, others scorned her as manipulative and heretic. The coronation of Anne Boleyn on June 1, 1533, was both a dazzling display of royal splendor and a deeply political act. Unlike Catherine, Anne was crowned with St. Edward's crown, a sacred relic typically reserved for monarchs alone, not consorts. This bold gesture underscored her elevated status and the legitimacy Henry was determined to bestow upon her and her unborn child. Yet this grandeur did not eclipse the disquiet. The streets were decorated and a series of pageants were held, but the public reception was noticeably subdued. Where once there might have been jubilation, there was tension, ambivalence, and even hostility. The people of London, deeply loyal to Catherine and suspicious of Anne's influence, watched the procession with skepticism. While the elite courtiers showed outward deference, whispers of dissent coursed beneath the surface. Anne's coronation was not just a celebration. It was a proclamation of a new religious and political order. By crowning Anne as queen under the authority of the newly established Church of England, Henry VIII sought to legitimize his break from Rome and assert the divine right of royal supremacy. Yet, international powers, particularly the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, viewed Anne with contempt and refused to recognize her status. The Pope had excommunicated Henry, and many European courts followed Rome's lead in condemning Anne as a concubine rather than a lawful queen. Diplomatic relations with Catholic Europe deteriorated, and Anne found herself a queen surrounded by enemies, both foreign and domestic. Nevertheless, Anne embraced her new role with fierce conviction. She knew that her position was precarious, and that much depended on the child she was carrying. She immersed herself in matters of court and governance, exercising influence through her intelligence and connections. Unlike many queens who confined themselves to ceremonial roles, Anne was vocal in her opinions and unafraid to involve herself in the king's policies. She supported the promotion of reformist clergymen and the patronage of scholars sympathetic to Protestant ideas. Her court became a haven for humanist thinkers and religious innovators. She surrounded herself with individuals who echoed her values. Those committed to an English church independent of Rome and a monarch unbound by papal authority. Anne's style was distinctly continental, shaped by her years in the courts of Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude of France. She introduced French fashions to the English court: low square necklines, French hoods, and elegant fabrics. She was a trendsetter, and her style was emulated by women eager to capture some of her mystique. But fashion was not merely an indulgence for Anne, it was a form of power. Every gown, every accessory, was curated to project authority, grace, and legitimacy. Her presence at court was commanding, a queen who understood the optics of power and the necessity of cultivating a royal image. Yet her outspokenness and sharp intellect, qualities that had once captivated Henry, now began to be viewed as liabilities in the eyes of many courtiers. And was not demure. She challenged opinions, asserted herself in conversation, and expected to be heard. This behavior, so unusual for a queen consort, clashed with traditional expectations of female modesty and subservience. Men at court admired her beauty and wit, but many resented her influence over the king. Women, too, often found her demeanor arrogant or aloof, particularly in contrast to the humble and pious Catherine. Her relationship with Catherine's daughter, Mary, was another source of controversy. Anne urged that Mary be declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession, a move that incited further hatred from those loyal to Catherine. Mary, fiercely devoted to her mother and her Catholic faith, refused to acknowledge Anne as queen, creating ongoing conflict. Though Anne sometimes expressed a desire for reconciliation, her actions, dictated by political necessity and personal animosity, deepened the divide. In time, this hostility would become one of the many sources of her undoing. The birth of a daughter, Elizabeth, in September 1533 was a blow to Anne's ambitions. Henry had risked everything: his marriage, his faith, the stability of his realm, on the promise of a male heir. While Anne's position remained secure for the moment, the absence of a son introduced a shadow of doubt. Elizabeth was celebrated, and Anne ensured she received a royal upbringing, but the disappointment was palpable. The king began to question whether his marriage was truly divinely sanctioned, and this uncertainty, though initially subtle, would grow over time. Despite the growing pressures, Anne continued to act as a formidable queen. She involved herself in court appointments, foreign policy, and religious reform. She read extensively, corresponded with reformers across Europe, and urged Henry to support policies that furthered the Protestant cause. She was not a passive ornament of royalty, but an active participant in the turbulent transformation England was undergoing. But the court was a place of shifting loyalties and concealed daggers, and had many enemies, some of whom had been loyal to Catherine, others who viewed Anne as an interloper who had risen too high. Her miscarriage in 1534 and the lack of a male heir only intensified these tensions. Henry, ever desperate for a son, began to grow restless. Rumors circulated about his interest in other women, including Jane Seymour, who would later replace Anne. Anne's outspoken nature, once seen as her greatest strength, began to alienate those around her. The very attributes that had captivated Henry now irritated him. The king who had once written her impassioned letters now began to withdraw, his affections cooling as quickly as they had once ignited. At court, whispers turned to accusations, and Anne found herself increasingly isolated. She had played the game of power masterfully, but now the board was shifting beneath her feet. Still, Anne's reign was a turning point in English history. She redefined what it meant to be queen, bringing intelligence, conviction, and agency to a role that had often been ceremonial. Her influence on the English Reformation, her patronage of reformist clergy and scholars, and her bold defiance of tradition left an indelible mark. Even in controversy, she shaped the course of a nation. Her legacy would endure, not only in the daughter who would become Elizabeth I, but in the transformation of the English monarchy itself. Anne Boleyn may have ruled for only 3 years, but in that brief time, she changed the fabric of England forever. The birth of Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth, in September 1533 was not the moment of triumph she had hoped for, but rather the beginning of a new and precarious chapter in her life as queen. After all the upheaval, the years of struggle to displace Catherine of Aragon, the break from Rome, and the establishment of Anne as Queen of England, Henry VIII had been expecting one outcome: a healthy male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. When the baby born was a girl, the reaction was one of thinly disguised disappointment. Though Elizabeth was baptized with royal ceremony and every outward sign of celebration was performed, the absence of a son was an undeniable failure in the eyes of the king and court. For Anne, it marked the beginning of an increasingly desperate struggle to hold her place. Despite this initial blow, Anne did not give up. She placed great hopes in future pregnancies, believing her body could still deliver the son Henry so badly needed. She poured affection and ambition into Elizabeth, insisting the infant be treated with all the honor due a royal child. Elizabeth's education, wardrobe, and attendance reflected Anne's intention that her daughter be raised as a future ruler. In hindsight, Elizabeth would indeed rise to become one of the most formidable monarchs in English history, but at the time, she represented only a partial victory for Anne. The Tudor court had no precedent for a female heir to sit on the throne unchallenged. A son was still essential, not just for Anne's security, but for the very legitimacy of Henry's entire religious and political reformation. Anne's next pregnancies, however, would not bring the hoped-for result. She suffered at least 2 miscarriages and possibly more, each one compounding the pressure and reducing her standing in Henry's eyes. The second miscarriage in 1534 was particularly painful. Some sources suggest it may have been a male child, making the loss even more devastating, and was reportedly inconsolable. These tragedies were more than personal, they had national and dynastic implications. Every lost pregnancy not only weakened Anne's influence but gave fuel to her enemies, who whispered that the marriage was cursed or that her failure to bear a son was a sign of divine disapproval. Superstitions and religious beliefs intertwined with court politics, and Anne found herself the object of suspicion, resentment, and growing hostility. As the years passed without a male heir, Henry's affections began to shift. Anne's charm, wit, and sexual allure had once held him spellbound, but now they began to wear thin. Her outspokenness, once refreshing, was increasingly seen as abrasive. Her sharp tongue and quick temper alienated courtiers and even the king himself. Henry, always conscious of his legacy and increasingly anxious about his lack of a son, began to drift away emotionally and physically. The king, who had once pursued her with passionate letters and romantic devotion, now sought solace elsewhere. The appearance of Jane Seymour at court marked a significant turning point in Anne's life. Unlike Anne, Jane was mild, reserved, and outwardly obedient, traits that appealed to a king grown weary of Anne's bold presence. Jane was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne, and their interactions were reportedly civil at first, but tension quickly developed as Anne sensed her husband's growing interest. Jane seemed to embody everything Anne was not, and her demure nature provided a striking contrast to the Queen's fiery disposition. Henry's fascination with Jane deepened, and he began to visit her in private, shower her with gifts, and treat her with increasing tenderness. The pattern of royal infidelity was not new, but Anne recognized this as something different. This time, her rival was not a passing mistress, it was a potential replacement. Anne's vulnerability at court grew more pronounced. Her enemies, including those who had remained loyal to Catherine of Aragon, saw an opportunity to bring her down. Even among the reformers whose cause she had championed, there were those who began to question her ability to remain in favor with the king. Her political position was weakened by her inability to produce an heir, and her behavior, sometimes erratic, deeply emotional, and confrontational, was used against her. She was increasingly isolated, even as she tried to maintain the appearance of regal control. The atmosphere at court became more hostile. Many of the nobles who had once supported and now courted favor with Jane Seymour and her family. The Seymours, particularly Jane's brothers Edward and Thomas, were astute enough to sense the direction of the wind and began quietly aligning themselves with the king's ambitions. Meanwhile, Anne's own family, including her brother George Boleyn, remained loyal, but their support was no longer enough to shield her from the rising tide of opposition. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, began to distance himself slightly, recognizing that his daughter's political capital was waning. At the same time, Anne continued to try to assert herself in matters of state and religion. She remained a patron of reformist thinkers and supported the spread of Protestant ideas. She corresponded with religious scholars and worked to place like-minded clergy in powerful positions. But even these efforts began to falter. The king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, once a key ally of and in bringing down Cardinal Wolsey and advancing the Reformation, began to part ways with her. Cromwell's relationship with and soured over differing strategies regarding church wealth and foreign diplomacy. He saw the benefit in a more conservative replacement for Anne, especially one who might bring reconciliation with Catholic powers like the Holy Roman Empire. By 1536, the year that would see Anne's downfall, her position was perilous. Her final pregnancy, likely in January of that year, ended in miscarriage. According to several reports, the fetus was male. This loss was the final straw. Henry, now convinced that his marriage to and was doomed, began to seriously consider ending it. The miscarriage coincided with news of Catherine of Aragon's death in January 1536. This meant that Henry was now free from his first marriage in the eyes of traditional Catholic doctrine. But instead of bringing renewed security, Catherine's death seemed to remove the last obstacle between Henry and his next desired wife. Anne's reaction to these developments revealed the depth of her anxiety. She was reportedly distraught, fearful, and even paranoid. She knew that her enemies were circling, and that Jane Seymour was increasingly seen as the king's future queen. The public no longer celebrated her as they once had. Her critics were emboldened, and even former allies had begun to waver. Her relationship with Henry, once so passionate and defiant, had turned cold and strained. She tried to reclaim his affection, using charm and tears, but the magic that had once held him had faded. Even in the final months of her queenship, Anne continued to fulfill her duties with dignity. She took part in court ceremonies, presided over religious functions, and ensured Elizabeth's household was well maintained. But beneath the surface, the reality was grim. She was no longer indispensable to the king. The long years of intrigue, ambition, and relentless pursuit of power had ended in a profound sense of betrayal. Anne had risked everything, her reputation, her faith, and ultimately her life, to become queen. Now the very qualities that had helped her rise were being used to justify her fall. Jane Seymour's ascendancy continued, and Anne's world narrowed. Where once she had been the center of Henry's court, now she found herself sidelined. Her enemies worked quietly, and soon, more dangerous accusations would begin to swirl. But even before the final blow, Anne's spirit was visibly worn. The pressure to bear a male heir had defined her marriage, and in failing to do so, she had lost her most powerful shield. In a court where a woman's value was often measured by her womb, Anne had given birth to a brilliant daughter, but not the son Henry required. In the end, Anne's story in these years is not simply one of personal tragedy, but of a system that demanded the impossible. She was brilliant, educated, stylish, and politically aware. She altered the course of English history and helped initiate the religious transformation of a nation. But she was ultimately brought down by the very forces that had elevated her: dynastic pressure, royal desire, and political machination. The struggle for a male heir had consumed her queenship, and in failing to meet that expectation, she became expendable to the very man who had once declared he would move heaven and earth for her. By 1536, Anne Boleyn's position as queen was increasingly precarious, not only due to her failure to produce a male heir, but also because of the growing number of enemies she had made at court. The political landscape at the Tudor court was always volatile, but Anne's rise and her strong personality had made her many powerful adversaries. The main factions that sought her downfall included the Seymour family, led by Jane Seymour, the conservative nobles who resented her influence on the king, and Thomas Cromwell, once an ally but now one of her harshest critics. These factions worked together to orchestrate Anne's demise, capitalizing on every opportunity to discredit her and undermine her position. The Seymour faction, which had once been in the background during Anne's ascent, gradually became one of her most dangerous adversaries. Jane Seymour, who had long been a lady-in-waiting to Anne, was a figure of growing interest for Henry VIII. Her quiet, docile nature was a stark contrast to Anne's bold and outspoken personality. As Anne's position grew more tenuous due to her inability to bear a son, Henry's attentions increasingly turned to Jane. The Seymour family, recognizing this shift in royal favor, began to position themselves strategically to gain influence at court. Thomas Seymour, Jane's brother, was an ambitious man who sought to advance his family's status by aligning himself with the king. And, ever vigilant, understood the danger posed by the Seymours, but there was little she could do to stop their ascent. As Jane became more and more favored by Henry, the Seymours began to gain a foothold in the court, making Anne's position even more vulnerable. At the same time, Thomas Cromwell, a figure who had played a key role in bringing and to power through his support of the English Reformation, began to distance himself from the Queen. Cromwell's motives were largely pragmatic. He had no loyalty to Anne personally, but was deeply invested in the political and religious upheaval she had helped set in motion. However, as Anne's grip on the king weakened and her failure to provide a male heir became more apparent, Cromwell recognized the opportunity to shift his allegiances. He had worked tirelessly to break England from the authority of the Pope, but now the political winds were turning, and a more conservative approach seemed more favorable. Anne's inability to secure the throne for Henry and the subsequent rise of Jane Seymour made Cromwell begin to reconsider his loyalties. His political calculations led him to align himself with those who sought Anne's removal, ensuring that the reform movement would not fall beyond the Seymour faction and Cromwell, and faced opposition from the conservative nobles, many of whom resented her influence over the king. These individuals had long been frustrated by Anne's push for reform, her role in breaking from Rome, and her efforts to place more power in the hands of the monarch. Many of the old aristocracy, who had been aligned with the Catholic Church, saw Anne as a usurper of traditional values and a threat to their own power. These conservative nobles were also dismayed by Anne's bold behavior and refusal to conform to traditional roles for women. They viewed her as an interloper, an outsider who had thrust herself into a position of power that she had not earned by birthright. Anne's relationships with the other women at court were also deteriorating. The tensions with Princess Mary, the daughter of Henry and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, were particularly significant. Mary had long refused to recognize her father's marriage to Anne, and she had been openly hostile toward her stepmother, and, in turn, resented Mary's refusal to acknowledge her as queen. The animosity between them was palpable, and Anne's insistence on enforcing her royal authority only deepened the divide. Mary's support of her mother, Catherine, who had been rejected by Henry, gave her a powerful position in the eyes of the conservative faction. Anne's strained relationship with her stepdaughter made it easier for her enemies to paint her as an illegitimate and divisive queen. Anne had always been a champion of her own daughter, Elizabeth, but the political fallout from the poor relationship between her and Mary had far-reaching consequences for her stability at court. Meanwhile, Anne's relationship with the Dowager Queen, Catherine of Aragon, also remained a point of contention. Catherine had been Henry's first wife and had refused to accept the annulment of her marriage to him. Her unwillingness to step aside for and created a rift that would last throughout their lifetimes. Though Catherine had died in 1536, her supporters still rallied to her cause, and Anne's association with the break from Rome and the resulting dissolution of the monasteries made her a focal point of Catholic resentment. While Anne had worked to place reformist figures in key positions, she was not universally supported, and the Catholic faction still wielded significant power at court. Anne's association with the Protestant cause made her a figure of distrust, not just in the eyes of her enemies, but also within the faction of the court that remained loyal to the old ways. The climate at court became one of constant intrigue, rumor, and betrayal. Spies and informants were everywhere, as the political factions tried to gather information and manipulate the narrative to suit their interests. Anne's enemies fed rumors to the king about her behavior and relationships, including accusations of infidelity, which were designed to discredit her. Her enemies portrayed her as ambitious, power-hungry, and unfit to rule, playing on Henry's growing disillusionment with her. These rumors, whether based in truth or not, fueled the perception that Anne was no longer a suitable queen. As the whispers grew louder, Anne's own supporters began to question her ability to hold on to her position. Henry, who had once been madly in love with Anne, began to grow cold towards her. The intensity of his passion for her had waned, replaced by frustration over her failure to provide him with a male heir. His infatuation was replaced by bitterness and a desire for a new beginning. He began to see Anne as a symbol of failure, someone who had promised him the future of his dynasty but had ultimately not delivered. Henry's coldness and his increasing distance from and reflected the growing influence of those around him who were eager to see her replaced. The king's emotional detachment and his focus on securing a male heir made it easier for those who opposed and to sway his opinion. Anne, isolated and vulnerable, became increasingly aware of her precarious position. Her influence at court was eroding, and her political enemies were closing in. The queen's enemies did not simply seek to discredit her. They actively worked to bring about her downfall. As her political power waned, Anne found herself trapped in a web of betrayal and manipulation, with few allies left to defend her. The Seymour faction, Cromwell, and the conservative nobles worked behind the scenes to orchestrate her eventual arrest and execution. Anne's inability to produce a son had proven to be her undoing, and the political machinations that had propelled her to power were now turning against her. She had once defied tradition and reshaped England, but in the end, it was the very forces she had challenged that would bring her to ruin. The fall of Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, is one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes in the history of the Tudor dynasty. By 1536, Anne had gone from being the glamorous queen consort, wife to Henry VIII, to a prisoner accused of crimes that would lead to her execution. The charges brought against her, adultery, incest, and treason, were as scandalous as they were politically motivated. Her arrest and subsequent trial marked the end of a turbulent chapter in English history, and the events surrounding her downfall have sparked centuries of debate, with many questioning whether her conviction was the result of a legitimate legal process or a carefully orchestrated plot to remove a queen who had outlived her usefulness. Anne's arrest took place in early May 1536, in the midst of a rapidly deteriorating political situation. Henry VIII, having grown disillusioned with and for failing to produce a male heir, had allowed the growing whispers against her to take root. As rumors swirled about her relationships with other men, including her brother George Boleyn, the king's mind was made up. The charges against Anne were grave, and they were calculated to ensure her complete discrediting in the eyes of the public. The first charge was adultery, which was a serious crime in itself, but it was the addition of the accusations of incest and treason that would ensure Anne's downfall. The accusation of incest, which involved Anne allegedly having an illicit relationship with her brother, George Boleyn, was particularly salacious and contributed to the sense of moral outrage that surrounded the case. Treason, the most serious charge of all, was a politically charged accusation, implying that Anne had conspired to undermine the king and the monarchy itself. The men accused alongside Anne were Henry Norris, a courtier and one of the king's closest associates, and several other men, including Mark Smeaton, a musician at court, and William Brereton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. These men, like Anne, were arrested and charged with crimes of adultery and treason. In the case of George Boleyn, Anne's brother, the incest charge carried an added layer of shock value, suggesting a scandalous and unnatural relationship between siblings. The charges were designed not only to ruin Anne's reputation, but also to further entrench the notion that she was unfit to remain queen. The trial that followed was a farce in many respects, as the legal proceedings were more about securing a conviction than ensuring justice. The trial, held in the Great Hall of the Tower of London, was presided over by a hand-picked jury, many of whom were known to be loyal to Henry VIII and hostile to Anne. The court was packed with nobles who had personal and political motivations for ensuring that Anne was convicted. Her enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, had worked behind the scenes to gather evidence and manipulate the process to ensure her guilt. The charges were vague, with little or no concrete evidence to support them, and the prosecution relied heavily on confessions obtained under duress. Anne's brother, George Boleyn, was among those who was tortured into giving a confession, which was later used to bolster the case against her. The use of torture to extract confessions was a common tactic of the time, and it was widely known that confessions obtained through such means were often unreliable. Despite the weak evidence and the lack of a fair legal process, the trial proceeded with little resistance. Anne was charged with committing adultery with 5 men, including her brother, and conspiring to murder the king. The case against her was based on a combination of fabricated testimony and the manipulation of her personal relationships. Henry Norris, for example, was accused of having an affair with, and, though there was no solid evidence to support the claim. Mark Smeaton, who was tortured into confessing, later retracted his statement, claiming that it had been coerced, but by then it was too late. The trial was conducted in a manner that reflected the political necessity of her removal, rather than a genuine pursuit of justice, and was not afforded the protections that would have been guaranteed to a monarch in a more just system, and the trial was more a formality than a legal proceeding. The public and personal reaction to Anne's conviction was mixed. For those who had long resented her and her rise to power, the trial and conviction seemed like the natural conclusion to her ambitious and controversial life. Many of the conservative factions in England, particularly those loyal to the Catholic Church, had been waiting for an opportunity to remove Anne, who was seen as a symbol of Protestant reform. Her arrest and trial played directly into the narrative of her being a dangerous and immoral woman who had manipulated the king for her own ends. The court's decision to accuse her of adultery and incest reinforced the idea that she was a sinful and corrupt woman, and for many, the trial confirmed their suspicions. Anne's enemies saw her as a threat to the status quo, and her downfall was a victory for those who had opposed the break with Rome and the reforms that she had championed. For Anne's supporters, however, the trial was a bitter blow. The Queen's fate seemed sealed, and there was little they could do to prevent her conviction. Many were horrified by the proceedings and the way in which Anne was treated. To them, the trial was a political execution rather than a legal process, and they saw it as a gross miscarriage of justice. Anne had once been a symbol of power and hope, a woman who had defied tradition and changed the course of English history, but now she was being dragged down by the very forces she had once helped to unleash. Her fall was a sobering reminder of the fragility of power and the ruthlessness of the Tudor court. Anne's own behavior during her imprisonment and trial was marked by a remarkable sense of dignity and composure. She maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings, refusing to confess to the charges, even though doing so would have spared her life. She faced her fate with a quiet strength, aware of the political forces that had conspired to bring her down. Her final days in the Tower of London were spent in reflection, as she prepared for the inevitable. She refused to break under the pressure, even when it became clear that the outcome of the trial was a foregone conclusion. Anne's refusal to confess to crimes she did not commit was a testament to her strength of character, and in many ways, it cemented her legacy as a woman who had fought against the injustices of the world she lived in, even when those injustices had finally caught up with her. In the end, Anne's trial was a tragic farce, a foregone conclusion that did little to preserve the integrity of the legal system or to protect the innocent. The charges against her were politically motivated, and the trial was little more than a formality designed to ensure her conviction. While many of her enemies celebrated her fall from grace, others mourned the loss of a woman who had defied convention and changed the course of history. Anne's tragic end has fascinated historians and scholars for centuries, as they continue to grapple with the questions surrounding her arrest, trial, and execution. Whether she was guilty of the charges brought against her or not remains a matter of debate, but one thing is clear: Anne Boleyn's life and death left an indelible mark on English history, and her story continues to captivate the imagination of those who seek to understand the complex and turbulent world of the Tudor court. Anne Boleyn's execution, a dramatic and tragic end to her tumultuous reign as Queen Consort of Henry VIII, remains one of the most poignant moments in English history. After months of imprisonment, trials, and political machinations, the fate of Anne Boleyn was sealed on May 19, 1536, when she was executed at the Tower of London. The circumstances surrounding her death, the events of her final days, and the aftermath of her execution are a testament to the profound impact she had on England's history, even after her death. This chapter will explore Anne's final days in the Tower of London, her last moments before her execution, the reaction to her death, and her legacy through her daughter, Elizabeth I. Anne Boleyn spent her final days in the Tower of London, a place of imprisonment for many of England's most famous figures. It was here that Anne, once a queen, was confined to a small cell, facing the charges that had been leveled against her: adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence against her was weak, and her trial was a farce, but the political machinations that led to her arrest and conviction were all too real. As Anne awaited her fate, her thoughts likely turned to her daughter, Elizabeth, who was still a princess and had not yet come to terms with the uncertainty of her own future. It was a bitter irony that Anne, who had been so determined to secure a male heir for Henry, would leave behind only a daughter who would one day become one of the most powerful monarchs in history. During her time in the Tower, Anne was allowed a certain degree of dignity and comfort. She was kept in relatively good conditions, though the psychological toll of her imprisonment must have been immense. The weight of the charges against her, coupled with the fact that her own brother George Boleyn had been implicated in the conspiracy, must have added to her sense of despair. Anne's fate was sealed when she was found guilty of adultery, incest, and treason, crimes that were largely fabricated by those who sought to rid themselves of her influence at court. Despite the injustice of her trial, Anne maintained her composure and her innocence, refusing to confess to crimes she did not commit. In her final days, Anne was allowed to see a few of her closest confidants, including her chaplain and some of her servants. She was informed that she would be executed by beheading, a method of execution reserved for women of higher rank. Her execution was set for the morning of May 19, 1536, and it was clear that the king, Henry VIII, had no intention of granting her a pardon. Despite this, Anne faced her fate with remarkable courage. She wrote a letter to her daughter, Elizabeth, urging her to be a good and faithful servant to the king and to never forget her mother's love. This letter, which has survived to this day, offers a glimpse into Anne's final moments as she prepared to face death. On the day of her execution, Anne was dressed in a plain gown, without the finery and jewels that she had once worn as queen. She was led to the scaffold, where a crowd had gathered to witness the execution. The execution was scheduled to take place at noon, but Anne was reportedly brought to the scaffold earlier than expected, possibly to avoid any further disruption. As she stood on the scaffold and delivered her final speech, in which she proclaimed her innocence and expressed her love for the king and her daughter, she maintained her composure and dignity, despite the fact that she was about to lose her life for crimes she had not committed. Anne's final words were reportedly, "I die the Queen of England, but I do not die in the faith of the Queen of England. I am a subject to my king and to my country, and I trust in God that my soul will be in his care." Anne's execution was carried out by a French swordsman, who had been brought to England specifically for the task. The choice of a swordsman instead of the usual executioner was significant, as it was considered to be a more merciful method of execution. The swordsman's skill was key, and it is said that Anne's execution was swift and efficient, with a single stroke of the sword. This moment of mercy in an otherwise unjust execution was seen by some as a small concession to the dignity of the fallen queen. For Anne, it was a tragic but perhaps fitting end, as she had once been a powerful and influential queen, but she was now reduced to a martyr for a cause that had not been of her choosing. In the wake of Anne's execution, the public reaction was swift and mixed. For some, her death was a confirmation of their long-held suspicions about her, and her fall from grace seemed like the inevitable conclusion to her rise to power. For others, particularly those who had supported her and believed in her innocence, Anne's death was a profound tragedy. Her supporters mourned the loss of a queen who had fought for reform and change in England, only to be betrayed by the very forces she had once sought to challenge. The spectacle of her execution, carried out in front of a large crowd, added to the sense of injustice that surrounded her death. Henry VIII, who had once been so deeply in love with Anne, quickly remarried after her death. His new wife, Jane Seymour, was soon pregnant with what would turn out to be the male heir Henry had long desired. Henry's swift remarriage and the birth of his long-awaited son, Edward VI, marked the beginning of a new chapter in England's history, but it also sealed Anne's tragic fate. She was soon overshadowed by her daughter's remarkable rise to power, and the memory of her death began to fade from the public consciousness, replaced by the legend of the girl who would one day become Elizabeth I. Anne Boleyn's death, however, was not the end of her story. The legacy she left behind would go on to shape the course of English history for generations to come, largely through her daughter, Elizabeth. Despite the tragic circumstances of her death, Anne's bloodline triumphed in the end, as her daughter Elizabeth became one of the most iconic and successful monarchs in English history. Elizabeth's reign, often referred to as the Elizabethan era, was marked by political stability, cultural flourishing, and the establishment of England as a major European power. Elizabeth's complex relationship with her mother's memory is well documented. Growing up in the shadow of Anne's fall from grace, Elizabeth would have been keenly aware of the controversy surrounding her mother's death. As queen, Elizabeth was cautious in her dealings with the memory of Anne, carefully balancing the need to acknowledge her mother's legacy with the political realities of the time. For many years, Elizabeth distanced herself from her mother's story, aware that her own position on the throne could be seen as illegitimate by some. However, as she grew older and her reign became more secure, Elizabeth began to embrace her mother's memory, seeing her as a symbol of the strength and determination that had helped her rise to power. The mythologizing of Anne Boleyn during Elizabeth's reign was also a product of political necessity. As Elizabeth sought to consolidate her power and establish her legitimacy, she was careful to cultivate an image of herself as the rightful heir to the throne. Anne's role in securing Elizabeth's position as queen was crucial, and over time, Anne's image was transformed into that of a martyr who had sacrificed her life for the future of England. This mythologizing of Anne was not just a matter of political necessity, but also an attempt to rewrite the narrative of her life and death in a more favorable light. Throughout the Elizabethan period, Anne Boleyn was depicted in art, literature, and iconography as a tragic and misunderstood figure. The portrayal of Anne as a victim of political intrigue and personal betrayal became a common theme, and her image was used to symbolize the power of female agency and resistance. The Queen's image was often presented in a romanticized light, reflecting the growing admiration for her intelligence, beauty, and strength, and was, in many ways, transformed into a symbol of the woman who had defied the odds and changed the course of history, even in death. The selective memory surrounding Anne Boleyn's life and death is a testament to the enduring power of myth and legend in shaping historical narratives. While the true details of her life and the nature of her relationship with Henry VIII will always be the subject of debate, it is clear that Anne's legacy endures through her daughter, Elizabeth, and the lasting impact she had on the course of English history. The tragedy of Anne's fall and death gave way to the triumph of Elizabeth's reign, and in the end, it was through Elizabeth that Anne's legacy was fully realized. Anne Boleyn's legacy is intertwined with both religious and cultural transformations that took place in England during the 16th century. Her role in the English Reformation, which would shape not only the religious but also the political landscape of the nation, is often underestimated. Anne's influence is not solely defined by her relationship with Henry VIII or her tragic fall, but also by her impact on the development of Protestant thought, the rise of reformist ideas, and her promotion of intellectual endeavors. Her role in encouraging Protestant thinkers and reformers, her patronage of scholars and Bible translators, and the lasting effects of her religious stance all contributed to England's gradual break from the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of a distinct religious identity. In the years following her death, Anne's memory would be further shaped by feminist reinterpretations of her life and the complex nature of her character. Anne Boleyn's involvement with the Reformation began long before she became Queen of England. As a highly educated and politically astute woman, Anne was deeply influenced by the Protestant ideas that were gaining momentum across Europe during her time at the courts of Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude of France. The religious climate in Europe during the early 16th century was marked by growing discontent with the Catholic Church, and many thinkers began to challenge the Church's authority and doctrines. Anne was introduced to these ideas through her education and her association with prominent figures in religious reform, including the humanist scholar and Bible translator William Tyndale. One of Anne's significant contributions to the Reformation was her patronage of scholars and reformers. In particular, she was a strong supporter of William Tyndale, whose translation of the Bible into English was groundbreaking at a time when the Catholic Church maintained strict control over religious texts. Anne's encouragement and support for Tyndale's work were pivotal, as they helped ensure that Protestant ideas were disseminated more widely in England. At a time when English translations of the Bible were scarce and often considered heretical by the Catholic Church, Anne's support for Tyndale's efforts helped promote the idea of personal interpretation of Scripture, which was a cornerstone of Protestant theology, and also patronized other reformist scholars, including those who sought to challenge traditional religious practices and promote Protestant ideals. By lending her influence and support to these individuals, Anne played a key role in creating an intellectual climate that was more receptive to the ideas of religious reform. Her patronage helped establish an environment in which the Church's teachings could be openly questioned, leading to a gradual shift in religious thinking in England. Although her support for Protestant thinkers would eventually lead to her downfall, it is clear that Anne played a significant role in fostering the religious transformation that would later define the reign of her daughter, Elizabeth I. In addition to her support for reformist scholars, Anne's personal religious convictions also influenced the religious transformation of England. Anne's own beliefs leaned toward the reformist side, and she became a vocal advocate for the idea of royal supremacy over religious matters. This belief would have a profound impact on Henry VIII's decision to break from the Catholic Church, as he sought to establish his own religious authority in England. Anne's influence on Henry is often credited with accelerating England's religious transformation, as her support for religious reform undoubtedly shaped the king's views on the subject. Through her encouragement and ideas, Anne became an important figure in the development of the English Reformation, which ultimately led to the establishment of the Church of England and the rejection of papal authority. Anne's influence on the religious landscape of England was further solidified through the events surrounding her marriage to Henry VIII and their eventual break from Rome. Although Anne's primary motivation for pursuing Henry's affections was not solely religious, her advocacy for reformist ideas and her ability to influence the king played a crucial role in the Reformation. The creation of the Church of England, with Henry VIII as its head, marked a dramatic shift in religious practice, and Anne's role in that transformation cannot be overlooked. Her religious legacy, although overshadowed by her personal life and tragic death, remains significant in the broader context of England's religious history. After Anne's execution, her memory was revisited by Protestant thinkers, who saw her as a martyr for the Protestant cause. In the years following her death, she became a symbol of the Protestant struggle against Catholic oppression, and her legacy was embraced by those who championed religious reform. Her association with Protestantism, especially in the wake of her death, made her an important figure in the Protestant narrative, and she was often portrayed as a woman who had sacrificed her life for the greater good of the English Reformation. Despite the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of her life and death, Anne's legacy as a reformer queen in spirit continued to resonate with Protestant thinkers, who celebrated her contributions to the religious and political changes that took place in England. In the centuries that followed, Anne Boleyn's life and legacy would be reinterpreted in a variety of ways, especially in literature, theater, and film. Over time, Anne became a figure of fascination, with her life and death often portrayed in dramatic terms. This fascination with, and would eventually give rise to feminist reinterpretations of her life, which sought to examine her actions, ambitions, and motivations in a new light. The portrayal of Anne in literature, theater, and film has been influenced by changing societal attitudes toward gender, power, and agency, and her story has been reimagined as that of a woman who challenged the norms of her time. In works such as Philippa Gregory's The Other Boleyn Girl and Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, Anne Boleyn is often depicted as a woman who was ambitious, intelligent, and determined to achieve her goals, even if it meant defying societal expectations. These portrayals emphasize her agency and ability to manipulate the men around her, particularly Henry VIII, in order to achieve her ambitions. In these interpretations, Anne is often presented as a strong and complex character who actively shaped her own fate. This feminist reinterpretation of Anne challenges traditional views of her as a passive victim of circumstance, and instead presents her as a woman who was in control of her own destiny, at least for a time. However, not all feminist interpretations of Anne's life are entirely positive. Some critics argue that Anne's ambition and actions were ultimately self-serving, and that she used her power and influence to manipulate those around her. In this view, Anne is seen as a woman who was willing to sacrifice anything, including her own family, in order to secure her place at court. This more critical interpretation of Anne's life raises important questions about the nature of power, ambition, and agency, and it highlights the complex dynamics of Anne's relationship with Henry VIII and the court. Was Anne truly a feminist icon who defied the odds and challenged the patriarchal norms of her time, or was she a manipulative figure who used her intelligence and beauty to advance her own interests? This debate continues to shape the way and is portrayed in modern retellings of her story. The portrayal of Anne in popular culture has also evolved over time. In early depictions, Anne was often portrayed as a villainess, a woman who manipulated the king and destroyed the lives of those around her. However, in more recent adaptations, she has been reimagined as a heroine, a woman who was ahead of her time and whose actions paved the way for future generations of women in positions of power. The shift in Anne's portrayal from villainess to heroine reflects broader changes in societal attitudes toward women's agency and power. In this context, Anne is increasingly seen as a symbol of female empowerment and resilience, rather than as a tragic victim of circumstance. Anne's legacy as a feminist icon is also influenced by the way in which she is remembered in art, iconography, and literature. The image of Anne as a strong, ambitious, and complex woman has become central to her modern reinterpretation. Through the lens of feminist theory, and is no longer just a historical figure who was at the mercy of male power structures, but a symbol of the potential for women to challenge those structures and assert their own agency. In this sense, Anne's memory has been reshaped into something more positive, as she has come to represent the struggles and triumphs of women throughout history who have sought to defy societal expectations and claim their own place in the world. The portrayal of Anne Boleyn in literature, theater, and film has undergone significant changes over the centuries, reflecting the evolving understanding of gender, power, and agency. From villainess to heroine, Anne's story has been reimagined as a tale of ambition, agency, and resistance to patriarchal norms. Whether as a manipulative figure or a feminist icon, Anne Boleyn's legacy endures, and her impact on both history and modern culture remains significant. Anne Boleyn's life and death have become one of the most enduring stories in English history. A queen who defied the traditional norms of her time, Anne Boleyn rose to power and prominence in the Tudor court, only to fall victim to a web of political intrigue and personal betrayal. Despite the tragic end to her life, her story continues to resonate today, serving as a symbol of defiance, intellect, and transformation. Through her actions and her legacy, Anne not only shaped the course of England's monarchy and religious identity, but also became a powerful emblem of power, agency, and the complex dynamics of gender and politics. At the heart of Anne's legacy is her defiance of the conventional roles available to women of her time. As a woman who rose from relative obscurity to become the queen consort of one of the most powerful kings in Europe, Anne's ambition, intellect, and beauty set her apart from other women in the court. She was not content with merely being a mistress to Henry VIII. Instead, she sought to be his wife, the legitimate Queen of England. This defiance of social and religious norms was a revolutionary act that not only changed the course of her own life, but also reshaped the course of English history. By challenging the Catholic Church and advocating for religious reform, Anne became a key figure in the English Reformation, which would transform the religious landscape of England for centuries to come. Anne's rise to power was intrinsically tied to the political and religious upheavals of the early 16th century. Her relationship with Henry VIII, which ultimately led to his break with Rome, was the catalyst for the establishment of the Church of England. Anne's support for reformist ideas, as well as her close connections to key Protestant figures like William Tyndale and Thomas Cranmer, positioned her as an important player in the religious transformation taking place in England. In many ways, she was more than just a queen. She was a reformer who championed the cause of Protestantism and helped to shape the religious future of the nation. Although her death was a tragic consequence of the political and personal dynamics within the Tudor court, her influence on England's religious identity was profound and lasting. Her legacy in England's monarchy is also significant. Anne's daughter, Elizabeth I, would go on to become one of the most powerful and respected monarchs in English history. Elizabeth's reign marked the height of the English Renaissance and the consolidation of England as a major European power. Elizabeth's success as a ruler can be partially attributed to the foundations laid by her mother, Anne. Elizabeth's ability to navigate the complex political and religious landscape of her time was informed by the very challenges that Anne faced during her own reign. As a queen who had to fight for her position and deal with constant political intrigue, Anne's legacy was one of resilience and determination. Elizabeth, while undoubtedly her own person, drew upon the strength and tenacity of her mother's Beyond her contributions to the monarchy, Anne's impact on religion was equally profound. By supporting Protestant thinkers and promoting the translation of the Bible into English, she helped to pave the way for the English Reformation. Anne's influence in the court of Henry VIII and her advocacy for religious reform were key factors in the break from the Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England. Her role in the Reformation has often been overshadowed by her tumultuous relationship with Henry and her tragic fall from grace, but it remains one of her most significant legacies. Her support for reformist ideas contributed to the creation of a more independent and Protestant England, which would continue to influence the religious direction of the country for centuries. Anne's legacy also endures in modern discourse, where her story continues to captivate historians, scholars, and the public alike. Her life has been the subject of countless books, films, and television series, each offering a different interpretation of her character and her impact on history. In these retellings, Anne is often portrayed as a complex and multifaceted figure, ambitious, intelligent, and politically savvy, but also deeply vulnerable and tragic. This complexity is what makes her story so compelling, as it reflects the nuances of power, gender, and politics in the Tudor court. Anne's ability to navigate these treacherous waters and ultimately rise to the position of queen, only to be brought down by political forces beyond her control, makes her a symbol of both triumph and tragedy. Her enduring popularity in modern culture can also be attributed to the way in which her story resonates with contemporary themes of female agency and empowerment. In an era where women are still fighting for equality and recognition, Anne Boleyn has become a symbol of a woman who defied the odds and challenged the patriarchal structures that sought to limit her potential. Anne's ambition, her willingness to fight for her place in the world, and her ability to manipulate the political landscape of her time are qualities that continue to inspire modern audiences. Her story is a reminder that women have always been capable of shaping history, even when society sought to constrain their power and influence. At the same time, Anne Boleyn's story also serves as a cautionary tale. Her tragic end, marked by execution and the fall from grace, highlights the dangers of ambition in a world where power was often precarious and fleeting. While Anne's intelligence, ambition, and defiance made her an important figure in history, they also made her a target for those who sought to bring her down. Her fall from power, driven by both political machinations and personal betrayal, underscores the vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals in a court where loyalty was often in short supply and betrayal was commonplace. Anne's life is a reminder of the fragile nature of power, and how quickly one can go from being at the pinnacle of success to being condemned to death. Ultimately, Anne Boleyn's story endures because it is a reflection of both the complexities of power and the resilience of the human spirit. She was a woman who refused to bow to the norms of her time, who fought for her place in history, and whose legacy continues to shape the world today. Whether viewed as a tragic figure or a powerful icon, Anne Boleyn remains a symbol of defiance, intellect, and transformation. Her story is not just one of ambition and downfall, but also of the lasting impact that a single individual can have on history. Through her legacy, Anne Boleyn has become both a cautionary tale and an emblem of power, an enduring reminder of the power of defiance, the consequences of ambition, and the complex dynamics that define history.